Today we're going to be creating a black and white still life from a photograph. I'm going to have you use the canvas paper I gave you. Make sure you tape the edges like we've been doing so we get a nice clean edge when we're finished. And we're actually going to start with a color and then we'll do black and white after. But before we even start painting, we want to block out our shapes and do just a nice light pencil sketch. You could use charcoal for this too if you like charcoal. Basically, I'm just doing some construction lines just to map out where everything's going to go on my paper. Make sure you draw nice and big and get the sizes right. If you don't get the sizes right now, you'll have problems later on. It's worth it to take the time to draw this out. Make sure you also lay in where the shadows are. This doesn't have to be a perfect drawing, but you just want to make sure you have the sizes right. Then I want you to pick out one color to work with. I'm going to just do this cyan blue. Just make sure you pick a darker color because we're going to use this to create something called an underlayer. This is where we're going to lay out our shadows. So before you do any major painting, it's important that you figure out where your light's coming from and lay in the shadows. So the first step for our painting is to just use any color and fill in the darkest areas. This is not going to be the color that we see later on. That's why we call it an underlayer. It's almost like a little map for yourself. So notice I'm also outlining some of the drawing that I did. I have some lines that are just not correct on here and I'm just going to ignore those. I don't even need to erase them. I'm just going to draw the lines in with my paintbrush where the lines are correct. And this can take a little bit of time if you're filling in a big area that's really dark, like my background here. You can use water to thin the paint. We're not adding white at this point to make it lighter, so if you need to make it look a little bit lighter for yourself, you can always thin it with water. And then once you've done the background, you can start laying in the shadows of your objects. So notice that the pear is darker on the left side, and there's a light hitting it on the right side. I'm just going to paint that dark side where there's a shadow, and I'm going to leave the rest canvas white. That's what you do with an underlayer. Notice this little shadow on the side of the pear. I want to really make sure I get those shapes of the shadows correct. And now I'll do this final pear here that has this sort of strange shape on the side because of its wider body. And I'm just going to leave the highlights canvas white. Be sure to check for those cast shadows on the table. Those are really important for giving some grounding to your objects. And then any other dark areas. Once you're done with your underlayer, you're going to start using black and white for this painting. I know some of you love color, but it's really important to understand how to blend values when painting. It's really what makes things look real. So with black and white, you're going to first start with your background. Some of you might have a light background. Mine's extremely dark, so I'm just going to paint everything black. Always start with the background and then move your way forward. As I start to get closer to the front of the table here, I'm going to start adding a little bit of white to my black and create a little blended hue. That's going to create a little bit of a light here. You can see on the photograph that the table gets lighter in this area where the light starts to hit the table. So as I add white to my paint, it starts to lighten up. And then I'm going to make it a little darker here in the front, just like I see in the photograph. I really want you to focus on what's light and what's dark today. Be sure to get those shadow shapes too. Once you've filled in the background and the foreground, you can move on to the subjects, or your objects that you're working on. Those should come next. So before I start doing those highlights of white, I really want to fill those shadows in first. The highlights come last. Now my pears are a little bit dark because they're in shadow, but they're not as dark as the black background. So I've created a medium gray for the shadows on my pears. And I can fill those in kind of evenly at first. And then as I get a little bit deeper into this painting, I can add more variety in the value in the shadow. Because these shadows aren't completely gray, there's actually some darker areas. You can see how I've added a little bit of a darker gray in part of that shadow of this pear. And now I'm working on that light side. I'll start to add the light here into the stem. It's really important to try to focus on the shadows. You're gonna get tempted to go work on the lights, but it's really going to help you out if you focus on doing shadows first, making sure you've got all of the variety of deep shadows and medium shadows, and then just finish your painting with the lights. The lights are the most fun, but they really shouldn't take as long as doing the shadows. If you have a palette knife, it can be really fun to apply your light highlights with a palette knife. But if you don't, you can just get a nice blob of white paint on your brush and blob it on there. Some of you might be really thick painters and some of you might be really thin painters. I tend to really like thick paint, so I may get some blobs and throw them on there. See where I'm adding these highlights? And this might be something that's new to you. Some of you might not have really done much work with value and shadows, but this is really our next step in terms of getting into realistic painting. Paying attention to light and shadows is really everything when you want to make a realistic painting. So this is an excellent exercise for you. I could probably keep going with these highlights. You can really get a lot of range of values if you let it dry and then start adding the white on top. Think about where you want to put your purest whites. And have a great time. Can't wait to see your paintings.